In 1901, in the deepest folds of Kentucky's Appalachian hills, the Delling family became the center of a storm that had nothing to do with the sky. You see, some bloodlines run thin, others run in circles. For generations, the Dellings had kept to themselves in Still Hollow, their name weaving back into itself on the family tree until the branches were tangled into a knot. They were a people apart, their secrets kept under floorboards and behind locked doors, their silence as thick as the valley fog. And in that silence, something was gestating. The land itself seemed to know it. Farmers spoke of the air growing heavy that spring, of the creek water running backward for an hour at noon, of birds falling silent whenever a Delling walked the ridge. This wasn't just isolation. It was a self-imposed quarantine of the soul. They weren't just avoiding the world, they were trying to keep something in or perhaps keep something out. The family had become a closed system, a biological echo chamber where the same whispers had been passed down for a century. And when you repeat a word enough times, it starts to lose its meaning. But what happens when you repeat a life, a face, a soul over and over again? It doesn't lose its meaning. It gains a terrible new one. This is the story of what happens when a family line turns inward for so long that it breaks, not into pieces, but into a perfect, terrifying reflection. It's the story of Marion Delling and the birth that the town, the church, and even the laws of nature tried to forget. It's about the children who came with the storm, the ones who answered to names that were never given. The night they were born, a thunderstorm clawed its way down the spine of the mountain. Old-timers would later say the sky itself looked bruised, lit by a strange, bone-white lightning that didn't flicker, it stared. Inside the cabin, beneath a roof that wept black water, Marion Delling was alone. The midwife, Rebecca Twill, arrived hours late, her horse spooked and her nerves frayed by the oppressive, watchful quality of the storm. Her journal, a record of every birth in that hollow for 30 years, tells a simple story. One girl born quiet, breathing like a whisper, alone by the hearth when I arrived. She noted the time, the mother's exhaustion, the single swaddled infant. One birth, one child, but by morning there were two identical woolen shawls, two infants lying on opposite sides of the cold hearth. They didn't cry, they didn't stir. According to the midwife's hushed confession to the pastor years later, they just blinked, slow, rhythmic, and perfectly in sync, as if they were a single thought testing the light for the first time. Rebecca, a woman of unshakable calm, was shaken. "I must have erred," she stammered, her voice thin. "Perhaps one was hidden, perhaps I was too tired to see what was already there." But her hand, when she wrote in her ledger, did not tremble. The entry never changed. One birth, one child. And so, from the very first breath, one of them was a ghost, a secret, a child who existed in the space between heartbeats in the corner of your eye. The town's official ledger lists no Delling birth in 1901 at all. It's a blank space, an empty line. It's as if the record keepers knew, instinctively, that some things are better left unwritten. Marion was the one who named them, or maybe she just spoke the names they already carried. Echo and Hollow. Not names for a baptismal record, but descriptions, whispers meant for the dark. In the margins of a pocket diary, stained with what looks like water or tears, she wrote a single chilling sentence. "They arrived during the split. I cannot say which came first, but they do not seem to notice." From that moment on, the Delling cabin became a fortress of quiet unease. Neighbors, who were rarely invited in, spoke of an unnerving symmetry within the home. The girls always sat facing one another, never speaking, never touching, yet their movements were a perfect, unbroken mirror. If one turned her head, the other would flinch as if to avoid a collision that wasn't there. A boy from down the hollow, who peered through their window one dusk, described it with a tremor in his voice for the rest of his life. He said it was like watching a single thought pass between two mirrors. Can you imagine that? To see not two children, but one consciousness occupying two spaces, a soul stretched taut between two bodies. It was this perfect, silent union that began to unravel their mother. Photographs of Marion before the birth show a woman with a strong posture, her eyes sharp and clear. The ones taken after show her, elsewhere. Slouched, unfocused, her gaze lost somewhere over the photographer's shoulder, as if she were trying to see both of her children at once, and the effort was breaking her mind. The division wasn't just in her home, it was inside her. The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. H.P. Lovecraft. The strangeness bled into everything. Marion's handwriting in letters to her sister began to fracture. The letter T would be crossed twice. The loop of a G would be doubled. Sentences would appear mirrored halfway through a paragraph, a perfect reflection of the line above it. Her final letter, the one she never sent, contained only a single phrase, repeated over and over until the ink bled through the page. They do not echo. They speak at once. The local physician, Dr. Callum, kept 2 ledgers. One for the town, filled with records of coughs and broken bones. The other was a black leather book for his private observations, for the things that defied explanation. In an entry from that summer, he writes, "Patient claims twin daughters born during storm. No clear physical trauma, but one child presents with bruises not observed at birth. Claims mirror injury from the other. Diagnosis withheld." The entry is violently scratched out, but if you hold the page to the light, you can still read it. He withheld a diagnosis because there was no word for it. There was no medical term for a wound appearing on one body when another was startled, for a shared pain that traveled not through nerves but through something else. The first true anomaly, the one that made the neighbors lock their doors, came not in speech or movement, but in breath. A woman who helped Marion during a bout of fever reported that if she held one girl's nose and mouth for just a moment to clear them, the other, across the room, would gasp for air. And if one cried, the other's skin would bloom with red marks like the ghost of a slap. It was a shared current, a single life force flowing between 2 vessels, and the town began to understand. They weren't raising 2 children. They were housing an impossibility. When the census man came knocking the following year, his ledger heavy with the names and numbers that make a community real, the Delling household reported only 1 child. Marion stood in the doorway, her face pale and still, and gave a single name, Eliza, just one. But a photograph remains, hidden for decades behind a loose frame in the church attic. A brittle, scratched image of 2 girls, side by side, identical down to the last fraying thread on their collars. But if you look closely, you'll see the light is wrong. Only one of them casts a shadow. This denial became the town's unspoken rule. At the Pine Brush Schoolhouse, the ledger for 1908 lists 1 student under the Delling name, Eliza, age 7, $4 paid for the quarter. But in every surviving class photograph, 2 identical girls are there, seated together, their postures perfectly mirrored. The teacher, Miss Hester Coombs, left behind a slim teaching log. Its pages are filled with a quiet, creeping dread. In one entry she writes, "She came alone today, or perhaps not. The room was colder than usual. She would not meet my eyes unless I turned my head slightly, as though there were 2 of her, and I had to choose which one to see." Other entries hint at stranger things, pencils rolling off desks before a hand could reach them, words appearing on the chalkboard that hadn't been spoken aloud. Miss Coombs noted that on spelling tests, Eliza's paper would sometimes come back with 2 sets of answers in the same handwriting, one on the front, and a different, equally correct set on the back. It was as if 2 minds were taking the same test, using the same hand. A quiet madness was seeping into the official record, a truth that refused to be erased. The other children in that one-room schoolhouse felt it too. They didn't have the words for it, but they understood the wrongness of the Delling girls. On the rare days when Eliza was marked absent, a strange stillness would fall over the classroom. "The room goes flat," one boy told his mother. "Like half the air is gone." Another girl said, "She just looks forward like she's waiting for the other to catch up." It was a presence defined by its echo, a life that was somehow incomplete when it was alone. In her later years, long after she'd left Still Hollow, Hester Coombs confessed to her niece, "I stopped calling her name after the 3rd year. What was the point? One was enough. They always answered together anyway." This decision, this quiet surrender to the impossible, threads its way through every piece of paper that touched the Delling family. The general store ledger shows regular purchases of matched clothing, 2 identical dresses, 2 pairs of boots, 2 hair ribbons, always paid for in a single sum. A receipt from December 1910 notes, 2 dresses, lace trim, identical cut, delivered to East Ridge. Buyer insisted on identical buttons down to the stitch. It was a conspiracy of silence. The whole town agreed to see only one child, even as they sold clothes for 2. They agreed to hear one voice, even when the air seemed to vibrate with a second, unspoken one. If you've come this far into the story, comment "The silence knows" below. You're not just watching this. You're bearing witness to a history that was deliberately buried, and now it's beginning to stir. A whispered historical rumor. It was said that Marion didn't give birth to 2 children, but to one child and its soul, which had somehow split off and taken physical form. The family's secrets were literally built into the walls of their home. When the Delling cabin was finally dismantled in the 1940s by a timber company, one desk drawer in the main room resisted. It was locked from the inside, though there was no keyhole, no mechanism to explain how. After prying it open, workers found it lined with oilcloth and bound with twine. Inside lay the private diary of Marion Delling. The ink was faded, but the words were a testament to a mind slowly coming apart. There were no dates, no greetings, just observations of 2 girls moving as one organism. Her handwriting is a map of her own fracturing sanity. At times, she writes with the clinical detachment of a scientist. She is restless again. She dreams of a place she's never gone, but the other remembers it. Then the clinical tone collapses into confusion. They do not know which one the dream belonged to. The early entries are small things, the kind of oddities a mother might dismiss. A shared twitch, an illness with symptoms that bounce between them. One would have the fever while the other had the chills. But as the pages turn, Marion's voice changes. She's no longer a mother cataloging quirks. She becomes a witness to something ancient and consuming. One passage, written in a steady, almost serene cursive, reads, "When they sit beside the stove, one girl hums a song and the other begins to mouth words she does not know. She seems aware of the tune only after it ends." That last phrase is underlined twice. Then Marion begins to document what she calls the bleeding. On several occasions, she notes that one child suffered a spontaneous nosebleed immediately after the other woke from a nightmare. The one who had the dream was unharmed. The one who was awake and calm was the one who bled. "They cry with one body but bleed with the other," she writes. "I cleaned her face while the other watched. She was not scared, only annoyed, as though it had been her turn and she missed it. Honestly, what would you do?" How do you raise children who are not 2 separate beings but a single broken circuit? The very structure of the diary reflects this impossible reality. Some pages are mirrored, with entries starting from opposite margins and meeting in the middle. A linguistic analysis done decades later revealed that certain phrases, when read backward, contain a hidden, darker meaning. The sentence, "She is not alone," becomes, "One alone is she." It's a code born of desperation, a mother trying to write down a truth that the rules of language itself were not built to contain. Between the entries, she inserts what look like patient charts, pulse, temperature, duration of symptoms. It's a woman clinging to the empirical, trying to measure the immeasurable. One note boxed in pencil reads, "When one feels pain, the other rubs her knee before the first one speaks." The reflex is not delayed, it is misplaced. The diary is a descent, page by page, into a reality where the boundaries of the self have dissolved. The final pages of the diary are different. The ink is pressed hard into the paper, the letters frantic and uneven. Entire lines are crossed out, smudged with graphite, or even burned at the edges as if she tried to destroy the words after writing them. But beneath the chaos, archivists found one repeated phrase, faint but relentless: "They are beginning to switch." What she meant by switching is never explained. But in the last legible entry, Marion's voice collapses into something close to panic. "The wrong one came down the stairs today. She wore the other's dress and tied the ribbon on the wrong side. When I asked her name, she smiled, but it was the wrong smile." No sentence follows. There is only a single, deliberate blot of ink in the corner of the page, round and dark, as if made by a fingertip pressed down with final, crushing force. After that, there are no more records of Marion's handwriting. No more letters, no more diary entries. The desk drawer, they say, was found locked again the following spring, sealed from the inside. Whatever truth she had uncovered, whatever final horror she had witnessed, was locked away with her. She had seen the reflection step out of the mirror, and the sight had broken her. You're not supposed to know this, but some things once seen can never be unseen. They become a part of you. They follow you home. A surreal, chilling visual. Imagine the two girls standing in a field of dead winter grass, perfectly still. One is looking at you. The other is looking at the first girl, but she has the exact same expression, as if she is seeing you through her sister's eyes. Sometime in the winter of 1909, the twins disappeared from view. They were moved to the second floor of the cabin, a cramped space with a slanted roof that pressed down like a closing jaw, and then they were sealed in. There's a carpenter's mark beside the doorframe, the ghost of a square nail head driven through from the outside. The iron is long gone, but the wood remembers. It holds the shape of its own violation. There is no official record of this confinement. No school absences, no church notices. The girls simply vanished, but the town knew. The store ledger for the Delling household started listing strange duplicates, identical books, matching gloves, preserved lemons always counted out in pairs. Deliveries were left on the front stoop. Inside the house, the twins remained together. Outside, they had ceased to exist. Those few who dared to step into the Delling home during those years spoke in hushed tones about sounds from above. Rhythmic knocks. Not frantic, not a plea for help, but deliberate. 2 knocks, then a pause, then 2 again. A man who came to fix the chimney described it as like breathing if breathing were made of wood. The pattern never changed. It never escalated. It just returned day after day, a heartbeat in the bones of the house. People learned not to look up. They learned to ignore the quiet, persistent rhythm coming from the sealed room, the same way they had learned to see only one child where there were two. It was easier that way. Reverend Alton Pike, who ministered in Still Hollow at the time, made a house call to Marion after a brief illness. His private journal details the visit with a chilling restraint. He notes her pallor, her reluctance to speak, and a cold that seemed to rise not from the winter air but up through the floorboards. He writes, "I asked of the children. She only gestured upward. I heard nothing until she opened the stove to add a log. In the silence that followed, a knock, then another. It was not a summoning. It was an acknowledgement. The attic window was the only part of them the world could still see. A neighbor boy climbing a ridge to find a lost goat claimed he saw them through the pane. He said they were sitting cross-legged on the floor directly across from one another, hands clasped between them. Their heads were tilted in perfect symmetry. He told his father, his voice shaking, they weren't looking at each other. They were looking through each other, like they were listening to something in the middle." His story was dismissed as a child's fancy. But decades later, when the cabin was surveyed for demolition, a photograph was taken from that exact same window. The photo, preserved in the county archive, shows the room stripped bare. But on the floor there are 2 worn indentations, exactly opposite one another. And between them, etched faintly into the wood, is a circle. Not drawn, not carved, but rubbed into the grain, as though something had been passed back and forth between them for years, until the wood itself remembered the motion. It was the shape of their shared existence, worn into the floor of their prison. No one ever gave a reason for why the room was nailed shut, and no document ever states when, or if, the door was ever unsealed. But in the spring of 1918, a brush fire swept the ridge behind the Delling home. Local men came to help, forming a bucket brigade from the creek. One of them, seeking shelter from the smoke, entered the unlocked front door of the cabin. He later described the second floor as being too quiet for its own shape. And there, near the doorframe, just below the old nail holes, he found something that made him leave without a word. 2 fingerprints pressed side by side into a patch of soft pine resin that had long since cooled. One print faced forward. The other was in reverse, a perfect mirror image. It was as if one hand had pressed from the inside and another from the outside at the exact same moment with the exact same pressure. They were not the prints of a struggle. They were the prints of an agreement. A seal, a promise made between a reflection and its source. The house itself had become a witness, holding the evidence of their strange, shared reality in its very grain. The fire never touched the cabin. It stopped at the edge of the property line, as if repelled by the silence within. The house stood, holding its secrets, waiting. We are all our own devil, and we make this world our hell. Oscar Wilde. In the winter of 1913, a physician passing through Still Hollow made an unusual request. His name is recorded inconsistently, Dr. Ellison Key or Quint Ellison, and his medical license, filed briefly in Lexington, was just as quickly withdrawn. He was a man chasing ghosts. He claimed to be studying paired anomalies among rural populations, a polite term for the strange stories that festered in isolated communities like this one. He had heard the rumors of the Delling twins, of mirrored gestures, of a child who would wince moments before her sister fell. His visit was not invited by Marion. It was arranged by a local schoolmaster, a man of science who believed that what the pulpit called demonic, a scalpel might explain as biological. The experiment he proposed was simple and cruel. One girl, the one the town called Eliza, was taken to a neighbor's barn, 40 yards from the house. Her eyes were covered. She was seated on a wooden stool with a nurse at her side. The other twin remained in the house under the doctor's direct observation. Marion didn't object. She just stood on the staircase, a silent statue, and refused to move or speak for the entire duration. According to the physician's field notes, salvaged years later, burned at the edges and water damaged, the moment the girls were separated, the twin left inside exhibited a sudden and total stillness. Her breathing ceased. Her pulse, checked at the wrist and neck, vanished. Her eyes stayed open, unblinking. Her body temperature dropped 3 degrees, but there was no rigor mortis, no pallor of death. It was as though a machine had been paused, not broken, simply suspended. 2 hours passed. The girl in the barn, the one called Eliza, began to weep. There was no prompt, no sound to startle her. Her tears just came in shallow waves with long, listening silences in between. She didn't speak. She didn't ask to go back. The nurse noted that she seemed to be aware of something happening elsewhere. When a door creaked in the distant house, the girl in the barn turned her head in that direction. They were reunited just before sunset. They didn't run to each other. They didn't embrace. One reached out a hand and the other waited a moment before taking it. The instant their skin touched, both girls collapsed to their knees and began to sob. But it was a discordant, overlapping sound, as if 2 separate, terrible stories were being remembered at once. And then the bleeding began. The girl from the barn, Eliza, began to bleed from the nose, then from her eyes. Within minutes, a thin, watery blood seeped from her ears. Doctor, the man of science, did not intervene. He didn't try to help. He just watched, closed his medical bag, and left. He never sent a bill. He returned to his rented room above the mercantile, and the shopkeeper said he spent the entire night tearing pages from his notebook and feeding them into the fire. He left town before dawn without his instruments. His name never appeared in another medical journal. He had come seeking a scientific anomaly, but he had found something else. He had found a law of nature that was not in any of his books. Only one sentence, scrawled on the final, charred page of his salvaged log, offers any conclusion. It reads, not separation, interruption. She was not missing. She was waiting. He had thought he was testing the connection between 2 sisters, but he was wrong. He wasn't testing the bond between 2 separate entities. He had taken a single being and stretched it across 40 yards of cold winter air. He had pulled a soul taut until it began to tear, and the backlash was something he could not measure, could not classify, and could not bear to remember. The nurse who assisted him was never identified. Her name appears nowhere. The barn has long since collapsed, but the field where it stood was later planted with willow trees. There is one row that grows taller than the rest, its branches curved slightly inward, as if they are still bending toward the ghost of a small girl sitting on a stool in the center, weeping for a pain that wasn't hers. You see, the doctor made a fundamental mistake. He assumed he was dealing with 2 people, but Still Hollow knew better. They knew you can't cut a reflection in half without breaking the mirror. A timeline shift. We jump forward to 1971. An antique dealer is picking through the ruins of the Delling cabin. He finds a warped panel in the ceiling. Behind it, a hidden attic no one knew existed. The air smells of ash and beeswax. In the center of the room sits a single wooden box. Among the last entries in Marion's second notebook, a smaller ledger found hidden beneath a false bottom in a dresser, are a series of incomplete phrases. The handwriting is faint, written in charcoal pencil. The words float on the page without context, under breath, between hours. One entry, repeated over several pages, reads, "They speak when not awake." It is not a language for the day. The twins, now approaching adolescence, had grown quieter in their waking hours. But at night, according to Marion's terrified notes, their sleep was no longer passive. Their mouths would move in perfect tandem, murmuring, not the random muttering of dreams, but a rhythmic tonal recitation. At first, Marion mistook it for humming. Then she began to recognize fragments of words, arranged in a grammar that felt ancient and wrong. She began to transcribe them by candlelight. The lines defied translation. But then she tried copying them backwards. When reversed, many of the phrases resembled scripture, fragments of Psalms, echoes of Ecclesiastes, but subtly altered as if translated through a series of dead languages. One phrase, when rendered this way, read, "He will not lead them beside still waters, he will unmake the shepherd." It was a corruption of something holy, a sacred text turned inside out. It was the language of the reflection, the tongue spoken by the shadow, and Marion was its only audience. She never told the girls what she was doing, but they seemed to know. They began waking at the exact same moment each night, between the second and third hour past midnight. They would rise without instruction, walk to the foot of their beds, and stand perfectly still for nearly an hour. No movement, no sound, just a dense, watchful silence like the held breath in a sealed room. In a letter she never sent, Marion wrote to her cousin, "They are quiet now, but it is not peace. I fear the silence more than the speech." When Reverend Pike was informed of this nightly ritual, his reaction was swift. He visited the home unannounced. He requested to speak with the girls. They stood before him, a perfect mirror, and did not answer. He read aloud from the book of Job, his voice filling the small cabin. The girls turned their heads toward him in perfect unison, their expressions placid, but they never opened their mouths. That night the Reverend returned to his chapel and tore 3 pages from his sermon journal. The charred remains, found later in the stove's ashpan, contained a single legible line, "They are in violation of natural order." Within the month, he requested permission from the church council to perform a rite of exorcism. He cited precedent from a disputed case in Mississippi involving a boy who spoke fluent Latin in his sleep. The council declined. There was no observable possession, they said. No thrashing, no blasphemy, just a terrible, perfect symmetry. When Marion was informed of the council's decision, she sent a note back to the Reverend. Her handwriting was steady, resigned. "They are not possessed. They are too alike for evil to take sides." It was a stunning, heartbreaking admission. She understood that what was happening wasn't an invasion from the outside. It was an imbalance from within. The perfect equilibrium of their shared soul had begun to tilt, and she was powerless to stop it. Her journal entries end shortly after that. Her final note on the subject is unsigned, unfinished, the graphite smudged as if she wrote it in a hurry and then dropped the pencil. It reads, "Last night one spoke alone. I could not tell which. The other was silent but moved her lips to match." That was the last thing she ever wrote about them. The silence had finally been broken. One voice had emerged from the echo, but Marion didn't know if this was a birth or a death. Was one of them finally becoming an individual? Or was one of them finally consuming the other? The untranscribed phrases, the mirrored language they spoke in their sleep, remained in a private family collection for decades. An archivist who studied them years later claimed that when he read the notes aloud in reverse, the final phrase seemed to echo behind him. Not as a voice, but as a breath, like something being said again, before it had ever been spoken for the first time. All religions are founded on the fear of the many and the cleverness of the few. Stendhal. The Halloridge Rest Home for Nervous Afflictions opened in 1899, built on the grounds of a shuttered textile mill. Its long, symmetrical wings were designed in the Kirkbride style, a theory of architecture that believed a balanced building could promote a balanced mind. It was a place of straight lines and ordered days, a fortress against the chaos of the human psyche. The intake ledger for the autumn of 1917 shows a familiar name, entered in faded ink: Marion Delling, age 45. Reason for commitment: believes daughters are one mind inhabiting two forms. The handwriting belongs to the head physician, Dr. Alwyn Gasp. His notes describe a woman who was not violent or hysterical but was convinced of the impossible in a way so calm it unsettled everyone who listened. Marion did not resist admission. She brought no luggage. When asked for her next of kin, she replied with a quiet finality, "They are not separate." In her first week, she was mostly silent. Nurses noted she would sit in a chair facing the corner of her room for hours, whispering, but not to herself. Her voice was measured, directed, as if she were giving instructions to someone standing right behind her in the plaster. No one came to visit her. No letters arrived. Her world had shrunk to the four walls of her room and the unseen presence that inhabited it with her. Her condition slowly worsened. She would only respond to questions if the speaker stood directly between her and the corner wall, breaking her line of sight to whatever she saw there. Medically, she was stable, but she began refusing to sleep. When the staff sedated her, she would weep silently in her sleep, her mouth forming words no one could understand. Her vocal cords remained still. Only her lips moved, shaping a silent language. One evening, a nurse heard humming coming from Marion's cell. It was a single-note melody, repetitive and childlike. When asked about it the next morning, Marion's answer was recorded in the staff log. "They sing it together. It keeps them awake. One sings in breath, the other in memory." By November, she had become almost completely catatonic. Her body was rigid, braced for an impact no one else could see. And yet, every morning the nurses would find her seated upright in her bed, the blanket folded neatly at her feet. Her door was always locked from the outside. The key was always signed out under Dr. Gasp's name alone. No one could explain how she did it. It was as if another set of hands were tending to her in the night. The hands of the one who sang in memory. In her final week, Marion stopped eating. She would only accept water if it was given to her from a child's tin cup. On the fifth night, a nurse making her rounds discovered markings on the wall above Marion's headboard. Two circles, uneven but deliberate, drawn in what looked like dried blood. They were joined by a single, straight line. The source of the blood was a mystery. Marion had no cuts, no wounds. The hospital log for December 7, 1917, is brutally simple. Patient expired during evening hours. No final words. No cause of death was listed beyond general failure of systems. Dr. Gasp, the man who had her committed, did not request an autopsy. He left the institution 3 months later, taking a position in a remote mining town out west, and his name vanished from the medical community. Marion's room was cleaned, repainted, and reassigned within a week. But according to staff reports that circulated for years, the markings, the two circles joined by a line, kept bleeding through the new plaster. After the third repainting, the wall was torn down and replaced entirely. And still, one nurse claimed that when the winter sun hit the fresh plaster just right, she could see two faint circles waiting beneath the surface. On her death certificate, the field labeled "Surviving Family" was left blank. It was the final erasure. The town had forgotten her daughters, and now the state had too. A whispered historical rumor. Nurses at the asylum said that on the night Marion died, the lights in her wing flickered in a pattern, 2 quick pulses, a pause, then 2 again, for nearly an hour. The rhythm of the knocking from the sealed room. By the spring of 1918, the Delling property had fallen completely silent. The chimney stopped smoking. The last milk delivery was left on the stoop to sour in the sun. With Marion gone, the hollow held its breath, waiting to see what would become of the secret she had kept locked away. That autumn, a circuit judge authorized the home to be surveyed for auction. When the county surveyor arrived, he found the front door unlatched, swinging softly in the breeze. Inside, a thick layer of dust coated every surface, a fine gray snow that had settled over a life paused mid-moment. A chair was tucked neatly under the kitchen table. A bundle of kindling was arranged in the hearth, ready for a fire that was never lit. There were no signs of a struggle, no haste, no abandonment. It was just empty, a place that had been waiting for someone who was never coming back. But the upstairs door was another matter. The nails had been driven clean through the frame from the outside and sealed over with pitch. It took 2 men with a crowbar to pry it open. The wood splintered and groaned, not in protest, but in a deep, weary reluctance. What they found inside was not a child's bedroom. It was a stage for a ritual. There were no beds, no toys, no clothes. There were only 2 small wooden chairs, facing one another at a perfect, intimate distance. The chairs bore the deep indentations of use. The grain of the wood was rubbed smooth, worn not by the passage of time, but by the pressure of constant, repetitive sitting. Between them, on the floor, lay a hand mirror. Its frame was scorched along one edge, and the glass had partially melted. Its surface rippled like water frozen in mid-motion. But there was no soot on the floor, no burn marks on the walls or the chairs. The mirror had been damaged by a heat that had existed only within its own frame. Beneath it, etched into the floorboards, were words, not scratched in a hurry but carefully inscribed. I see her when I close my eyes. I hear her when I forget myself. The sentence was repeated in a mirrored arc so that if you stood between the chairs, you would read it twice, once forwards and once in reverse. The surveyor's assistant, a man named Eli Merton, wrote a brief, shaken statement in his report. There were footprints in the dust, he wrote, identical, facing inward. Like someone had turned to leave but didn't. The footprints were small, unshod, and perfect. There was no variation between the left and the right. As he put it, it was not 2 children who had stood there. It was one, reflected precisely. No other items were ever recovered from the house. It was left standing, a hollowed-out monument to a story no one wanted to tell. For decades, the house stood empty. Hikers and hunters reported strange things. A light in the upper window at night, even though the glass was long gone. The sound of a girl humming, a tune that would stop the moment you tried to listen too closely. In 1952, the Ashe County Historical Society made a brief attempt to preserve the cabin. When they entered the upstairs room, the chairs were still there. The mirror had cracked in 3 new places, spiderwebbing out from the center. The words on the floor remained, but the footprints were gone. There was only a layer of undisturbed dust, except for a faint, circular depression right in the center where something heavy had once sat, facing its own echo. The house had finally finished forgetting them. The evidence was being erased, not by time but by the place itself. It was pulling the story back into the wood, back into the dust, back into the silence where it had begun. You're not just watching a story about a family. You're becoming part of a hidden history, a truth that bleeds through the cracks of the official record. And once you know it, you're responsible for it. You become one of the keepers of the secret. A surreal, chilling visual. Imagine the upstairs room, empty except for the 2 chairs. The dust motes in the air are completely still, except for a single, swirling vortex in the space between the chairs, as if someone is exhaling there, very, very slowly. Still Hollow Cemetery sits on a sagging piece of land where the ridge road begins to crumble. The headstones are simple, local stone, carved by hand. The names and dates align with the church ledgers. Family plots are neat. Everything has its place. Everything is accounted for, except for 2 graves. In 1894, a burial was recorded in the chapel's death register. The name is listed as Eliza Delling, age 13. Cause of death is left blank. The line for the attending physician is empty. Following the entry, there's a brief note in a tidy, unfamiliar handwriting, companion to be placed adjacent. No stone requested. That same week, the cemetery ledger shows the purchase of a single plot by an unnamed woman who paid in coin. There is no signature. The gravedigger's logbook from that season records 2 interments side by side in that plot, but it only lists one name, Eliza. The second grave was dug, filled, and marked with a stone identical to the first, but its face is blank. Not weathered, not erased. It was simply never carved, a placeholder for a person who had no official existence. From the very beginning, the graves were wrong. For the first year, they lay flush with the earth. But by the second year, the blank stone began to dip, leaning forward as the ground beneath it drew inward. It wasn't the slow, even settling of soft soil. It was a quiet, persistent pull, as though the grave wasn't sinking from the weight above, but was being drawn down by something loosening below. Marion, who had died in the asylum years before, had no burial recorded here. The county marked her as cremated, though no record of it exists. The only hint of a funeral for her daughters comes from a private letter. A local resident, Margaret Tills, wrote to her sister. A funeral was held, no more than 5 people at dawn. There were no spoken words. There was a song, but it came from no one I could see. It was the same tune they hummed at the market, the one that stops when you listen. Over the decades, caretakers tried to fix the sinking plot. They packed it with soil, with clay, with gravel. Each time the ground would hold for a few months and then slump again, the blank stone tilting further as if bowing to its named twin. One mason offered to engrave the blank stone for free, to give the forgotten child a name. But the night before he was to do the work, he had a dream. He said he saw 2 girls sitting across from each other. One was bleeding from the eyes. The other was humming through closed lips. He refused to complete the job. In 1967, a historical society intern trying to update the cemetery records came to the same conclusion as everyone before him. 1 name, 2 graves. He left a note in the margin of the report, a question written in ballpoint pen. Which one is missing, and which one was never counted? Today, the unnamed grave continues to shift. Its edges fold into the earth, as though the soil itself has begun to remember something the records were told to forget. The restorations became a local legend. The first was in 1910. The groundskeeper, Morris Welk, wrote in his log, "Soil firm by morning, soft again by dusk. Stone won't hold. Lower corner pulling like a drain, but the water line is dry." He noted that Eliza's stone, just inches away, hadn't budged. The second attempt was in 1916. A new gravedigger, a practical man with no time for stories, filled the depression with red clay and tamped it solid. Within 2 weeks, the ground had slumped again, the clay pulled down into a concave bowl. The man resigned without notice. He later told his wife he'd started having dreams of 2 girls standing on opposite sides of a mirror, asking him the same question over and over: which one do you see when you look away? During the third restoration, workers were hired from out of county. They dug deeper. They found no casket, no bones, no remnants of a burial at all, just cold, dry earth. Then the shovel hit something solid. It wasn't bedrock. It was smooth and slightly curved. They stopped digging. The next day, one of the workers came back alone to investigate further. He was never seen again. His tools were found stacked neatly at the edge of the grave, beside a folded linen handkerchief that wasn't his. In 1936, the cemetery superintendent, a no-nonsense man named Claire Meddy, wrote in his annual report, "We can plant grass and we can place new fill, but the earth at lot 17B takes everything back. It is not rot. It is recall." He ordered the blank stone to be left alone. The past is never dead, it's not even past. William Faulkner. The final attempt to understand the grave came in 1983. Margaret Ellen Delling, a distant relative and retired librarian, began compiling a family genealogy. Frustrated by the conflicting records, she arranged to have Eliza's grave exhumed as part of a university forensic project. The remains they found were consistent with a girl of about 13. But the DNA analysis produced an impossible result. The mitochondrial profile contained inconsistencies, a misalignment between samples taken from the left and right sides of the body. In her notes, the lead graduate student wrote, "The body exhibits dual genetic markers. Structure suggests 2 sets of instructions reconciled awkwardly, like stitching from opposite ends of a pattern. I cannot determine if this body belonged to one twin or both. It wasn't one person, and it wasn't 2. It was something in between." A biological contradiction lying in the earth. Margaret Delling abandoned her project immediately after seeing the report. She moved away and left no forwarding address. In her notes, she had taped a slip of paper to the DNA charts. On it, she'd written, "If one girl cried and the other bled, which one is buried and which one watched?" On the back of the paper, in a faint, mirrored cursive that was not hers, someone had added another line. "Reflections don't leave shadows, but something always moves behind them. The grave holds a body that is both singular and plural, and the empty plot beside it, it isn't sinking, it's making room." Let's go back to that hidden attic, to the wooden box found in 1971. The antique dealer Ronald Meeks opened it in his workshop. Inside there were 3 items. First, a long, thick braid of light brown hair wrapped in cloth, a keepsake. Second, 2 small, hand-stitched dresses worn at the sleeves, but they had been sewn together at the hem, not in a hurry but with a careful, deliberate seam, as if binding them into a single garment. The seam had been adjusted many times, let out and then tightened again, as if accommodating 2 bodies that were sometimes closer and sometimes further apart. The final item was a notebook. The cover was stiffened canvas. Inside, the pages were filled with dense, mirrored script, with lines written from left to right and right to left, converging in the middle of the page. The language was English, but reversed. One line appeared 3 times, spaced pages apart. "When I sleep, she watches. When I wake, I wait for her to close her eyes." On the opposite pages, where the mirror text would be, there were only faint impressions, as if something had been written and then furiously scrubbed out. The last 2 pages of the notebook are sealed together, not with glue or moisture, but with pressure, as if the book had been slammed shut on a final, terrible secret and held that way for half a century. Any attempt to separate them risks destroying the paper itself. The truth is in there, but it refuses to be read. Ronald Meeks, the dealer, kept the box for years. He never sold it. In an interview, he admitted, "I'd look at those dresses, sewn together like that, and I'd wonder if they were ever meant to be taken apart again." The notebook was donated to the county archive. The braid of hair was buried in an unmarked plot by request of the family's last known relative. But the dresses, they vanished. A textile historian borrowed them for study, and they were never returned. The only thing she left behind was a single, penciled note on the back of a patterned sketch. It read, "2 hems joined by hand, but neither side was stitched first." Can you imagine that? It's an impossible seam, a paradox in thread and fabric, just like the grave, just like the DNA, just like the footprints in the dust. Every piece of physical evidence they left behind points to the same impossible conclusion. They were not 2 separate things that had been joined together. They were one thing that had been inexplicably divided, and every action they took, from the way they sat, to the way they slept, to the way their clothes were sewn, seems to have been an attempt to undo that division, to merge back into the single being they were always meant to be. It wasn't a life they were living. It was an argument with reality. There is one final piece. In the Cumberland County Archive, in a quiet corner, there is a sealed glass case. Inside is a small, tarnished brass hand mirror. The museum placard is simple: "Mirror, personal, circa 1890, recovered from still hollow." But the internal staff log tells a different story. It's labeled, "Artifact 447B, Delling Residence. Observed irregularities under low light." The mirror was found beneath the floorboards of the sealed upper room. The glass has fogged with age, its surface too soft to cast a clear reflection. And yet, under certain conditions, it seems to reflect more than it should. In 1987, a custodian was cleaning the display case late at night. In his official incident report, he stated, "When I leaned forward, I saw my face, but behind it, like too close to be behind it, was another face. Same mouth, same eyes, just reversed, and it blinked first." He requested to be reassigned to another floor. The museum tested the mirror for flaws: double glazing, embedded lenses, unusual curvature. They found nothing. It's a simple piece of glass and brass. But under candlelight, the condensation that is permanently trapped inside the sealed frame has been observed to move. Not in drips or streaks, but in slow, circular patterns, like breath fogging a window pane, moving in rhythm with an unseen chest. An old handwritten note found tucked into the mirror's accession file claims it belonged to Marion. The note, scribbled on the back of a grocery receipt, says simply, Mirror from upstairs room, found between joists, belonged to the one who remained, not one of them. The writer knew. They knew that one was buried, or at least the body was, and one remained. The curators have an unspoken policy. They never polish the glass. A former collections manager, when asked why, just said, "Because what if it's not dust?" Over time, a fine film has accumulated on the inside of the case. The lights above it have been dimmed. The mirror no longer reflects much of anything, unless, as several night staff have reported, you happen to walk past it when the room is completely empty and silent. According to an anonymous note left in the archive's suggestion box, you don't see her when you look in the mirror. You see her just after you stop looking. It's the final echo, the last ripple of a life that refused to obey the rules of reality. A face that only appears in the space between glances, a presence that lives in the corner of your eye. Some names are not just forgotten. They were never meant to be spoken aloud in the first place. In the deep, quiet hollows of Appalachia, what lived without a record did not live without a memory. The land remembers. The wood remembers. The dust remembers. And somewhere behind a door that was never meant to open, in a grave that refuses to stay still, a story is waiting, not to be told but to be felt. It's a story about the terrifying fragility of the self, about what happens when the line between you and your reflection begins to blur. The Delling family created a closed loop, and born into that loop was a living paradox, a soul that couldn't be contained in a single body. They weren't evil, they weren't possessed, they were just wrong, a glitch in the fabric of things. And the world did what it always does with things it cannot understand. It tried to erase them. It left one of their names off the record, it nailed them into a room, it buried one without a name. But it didn't work, because you can't erase an echo. An echo is the proof that something was there. It's the memory that sound leaves behind in the air. Echo and hollow. One was the sound and one was the silence that followed, and in that silence she remains, waiting. If you found yourself watching this story a little too closely, if something in the telling refused to stay still in your mind, then you understand. We invite you to linger with us here in the shadows of history. Like this video, and subscribe to uncover the stories that time itself has tried to erase. Now tell us in the comments, if you looked in that mirror, whose face would you be afraid to see behind your own?